I found my husband's DNA test and realized he wasn't the man I married. He switched identities with his dead twin brother 20 years ago. For 12 years, I loved Robert Sullivan. He was my husband, the father of my 2 children, a successful architect, and the definition of stability. Our life was comfortable, predictable, and I believed utterly transparent. Robert was known for his quiet consistency, his aversion to risk, and his fierce dedication to protecting his family's privacy, a privacy I always attributed to the trauma of his youth. His twin brother, Ethan, died tragically 20 years ago in a climbing accident during their university years. Robert never spoke about Ethan, citing the pain and the finality of the loss. Ethan was the reckless, magnetic twin. Robert was the reserved, reliable survivor. The foundation of my reality was dismantled by a simple, mandatory genetic test. Robert, as a requirement for a massive multi-million-dollar corporate contract, needed to submit a full DNA profile to the client's security team. Robert, usually meticulous with paperwork, was visibly anxious and evasive about this final step. He insisted on handling the submission himself, claiming the client was overly secretive about the lab they used. The test results were supposed to be delivered exclusively to the client, but due to a technological glitch, a simple email server error, the full unredacted report was accidentally forwarded to our joint household email account. I discovered it late one night while clearing out the spam folder. The attachment labeled Sullivan E. Final Genetic Marker Report was massive and intimidatingly scientific. I opened it out of simple curiosity. The report confirmed Robert's genetic profile, but the summary box at the top sent a cold spike of terror through my chest. The name listed was not Robert Sullivan. The name on the DNA report matched to the genetic markers and identification number was Ethan Sullivan. I stared at the screen, paralyzed. My husband's name was Robert. Ethan was the twin who died 20 years ago. My initial thoughts spiraled into fantastical absurdity. Was it a common lab error? Was the client reusing an old file? But the genetic markers were definitively Robert's, or rather the man I knew as Robert. I quickly accessed old family documents, his passport, his birth certificate, all listed Robert James Sullivan. Everything official pointed to Robert, but the genetic truth on the screen pointed exclusively to the deceased brother, Ethan.
My curiosity transformed into a frantic, sinking dread. I spent the rest of the night cross-referencing the report with public records. I located old, archived newspaper reports about the climbing accident 20 years ago. The reports detailed the deaths of 2 students. The bodies were recovered days later, severely damaged. The identification, the report stated, was done primarily through dental records and personal effects. The official death certificate clearly named Ethan Sullivan. But the man sleeping upstairs, the man who was legally Robert Sullivan, was genetically Ethan. The realization was a profound, existential shock. The man I married was not Robert, the reserved architect. He was Ethan, the reckless twin who was officially dead. The real Robert, the one whose identity he had assumed, was the one who actually died on that mountain 20 years ago. The chilling question wasn't if he lied, but why he had orchestrated such a complex, profound identity theft. I began an intensive investigation into the past lives of the 2 brothers. Accessing old university records and legal documents, I quickly found the motive for the switch, rooted in the final semester of their university life. The real Robert Sullivan, the studious twin, had committed a massive career-ending act of fraud, embezzling a significant amount of money from the university's research foundation, a crime that was about to be exposed. The reckless twin, Ethan, while morally flawed, had a clean legal slate. The mountain climbing accident, therefore, wasn't just a tragedy. It was a cold, calculated opportunity. When the bodies were recovered, Ethan, the morally dubious twin who survived, assumed the identity of Robert, the legally compromised twin who died. He used the chaos of the accident and the poor condition of the bodies to secure his escape from Ethan's life and from Robert's impending legal disaster. He had literally died to the world as Ethan to live securely as Robert, shedding a looming prison sentence and taking on a stable identity. The stability I loved, the predictability I cherished, wasn't Robert's quiet personality. It was Ethan's desperate attempt to maintain the facade of a clean, unassailable identity. His aversion to risk wasn't natural. It was the intense, crippling fear of a fugitive who knew one wrong move, one DNA test, one slip of the tongue would collapse his entire existence. I looked at the pictures of our children, realizing their entire legal identity, their last name, their inheritance, their security was built on a lie. Their father was a ghost, a legal fiction created 20 years ago to escape prison. I knew I had to confront him, but I needed to secure my children's future first. The discovery wasn't just a divorce. It was a forensic undoing of my entire life. The hours between the discovery of the DNA report and Robert's return home were spent not in panic, but in frantic, calculated preparation. I secured every legal document related to our marriage, our children's birth certificates, and every financial asset we jointly held. I knew that the man I married was a ghost, and when I exposed him, his entire fabricated life, our life, would implode, leaving a legal vacuum where our security once stood. When Robert, or rather Ethan, walked in the door, he looked tired but composed, the image of the predictable architect. He kissed me, and I felt nothing but a cold, hollow revulsion. I led him into the study, the room where he spent his life building architectural illusions, and closed the door. I didn't start with the DNA. I started with a quiet, precise question about the past. "Tell me about the University Research Foundation, Robert," I asked, watching his face closely. "Tell me about the $100,000 that was embezzled 20 years ago, just before the climbing accident." The blood drained from his face instantly. The mention of the specific decades-old fraud confirmed my deepest fears. He didn't deny the embezzlement. He looked at me with pure, paralyzing terror, knowing the game was over. I placed the DNA report on his desk, the name Ethan Sullivan prominently displayed. "You're not Robert, are you? You're Ethan, the one who lived, the one who switched places with the brother who died to escape prison?" He sank into his leather chair, the facade dissolving completely. He was no longer the reserved, stable Robert. He was the panicked, desperate Ethan. He confessed everything, the narrative spilling out in a desperate, raw torrent of self-justification and sorrow. The truth was rooted in a moment of reckless desperation. Robert, the studious twin, had succumbed to pressure and financial temptation, embezzling the funds just before graduation, a crime that guaranteed jail time and professional ruin. Ethan, the twin I thought was reckless, was actually the one who discovered the fraud. They were on the climbing trip when the news of the impending investigation reached them. When the accident occurred, a genuine catastrophic slip, Robert was killed instantly. Ethan survived with minor injuries. Realizing the unique,
horrifying opportunity the tragedy presented. Robert was dead, and he was ruined, Ethan confessed, his voice choked with grief and the cold, pragmatic memory of the moment. I wasn't ruined yet. I wasn't the criminal. I made the choice in the hospital. I claimed Robert's name. I used the damaged bodies and the confusion to convince the identification team. I took Robert's ID and I buried Ethan. I took Robert's stable future and I let Ethan, the failure, die on that mountain. He admitted the stability I loved was entirely fabricated, a prison of his own making. He became the reserved, risk-averse architect not out of personality, but out of absolute fear that one mistake, one impulsive, Ethan-like decision would expose the lie. He constantly checked the statute of limitations on the university fraud, finding that by assuming Robert's identity, he successfully avoided the charges years ago. But the identity fraud itself was perpetual. I did it for a stable life, Sarah, he pleaded. I did it so I could be the man who deserved you. I genuinely loved you, and I desperately wanted to be the good man you married. Every day of our marriage was a constant performance, a quiet terror that you would find out. His confession, while raw, only solidified the profound nature of the betrayal. He hadn't just lied about his name, he had stolen the entire identity of the man who died, used his stable reputation, and built a life with me on a foundation of professional crime. Our marriage was a legal fiction, our children's security a technical vulnerability. The agonizing choice was now mine. Exposing him meant not only divorce and personal ruin, but also exposing a decades-old crime, likely leading to his arrest for identity fraud and potentially reopening the embezzlement case under the statute of limitations. It would also plunge my children into a devastating public scandal, jeopardizing their inheritance and their emotional security. Keeping the secret meant living with a ghost, an identity thief who had used me as a shield from prison for 12 years. I realized the answer lay in protecting the innocent, my children, and the legacy of the man who truly died. I walked over to the safe, pulled out the legal documents I had prepared, and placed them on the desk. I filed for divorce this morning, Ethan, I said, calling him by his true name for the first time. Our marriage is void. You used fraud to enter my life. Now the clean life you stole for yourself is over. You will sign over the assets and agree to a private settlement that ensures my children's security, or I will hand the full, unredacted DNA report and the records of the university fraud to the FBI. The choice is yours: a quiet exile or the public collapse of your life. I had become the executor of his justice, the keeper of his identity, and the only person who knew which twin truly survived. The confrontation in the study was the end of Robert Sullivan, the architect. The silent, terrifying threat of exposure, the DNA reports and the university fraud records was the only currency I needed. Ethan, faced with the absolute certainty of his life collapsing into a federal prison sentence for identity fraud and potential renewed charges for the underlying embezzlement, chose silence and exile. He agreed to my terms immediately, without resistance. His deepest fear was not losing me, but losing the stable identity he had stolen. The legal process that followed was a complex, private unraveling of a life built on a phantom. My lawyer, a genius of discretion, worked tirelessly to divorce me from Robert Sullivan, the legal entity, while simultaneously securing my children's future from Ethan Sullivan, the genetic ghost. The settlement was massive and quiet.
Ethan signed over the entirety of his assets and income stream to a trust established for our daughters, ensuring their financial security was protected from the eventual public exposure of the fraud. I filed for the divorce to be finalized on the grounds of fraudulent representation of character, a precise legal term that allowed us to avoid revealing the full extent of the identity theft in public court records. The moment the papers were signed, Ethan Sullivan, the man who had lived as my husband for 12 years, vanished. He left the country quickly, quietly, taking nothing but a backpack and the burden of his true name. I never saw him again, and I never will. I do not know where he went, and I do not want to know. His freedom was the price he paid for my silence and my children's security. The aftermath in my personal life was defined by the impossible task of explaining the void. I told my children that their father had accepted a permanent, demanding job overseas and could only communicate sparingly. The pain of maintaining this lie, protecting them from the devastating truth that their father was an identity thief who should have been in prison, was a continuous, heavy burden. I had to become the sole, unshakable source of stability, replacing the ghost with a real, dependable parent. The most profound realization was the collapse of my personal history. I spent months obsessively reviewing every memory, every conversation, trying to distinguish between the personality of the real Robert and the performance of the surviving Ethan. Did Ethan love me, or did he merely need me as a crucial prop in his clean life? I accepted that the answer was irrelevant. The love was built on a lie, and the foundation was rotten. My recovery was not about forgiveness. It was about the reclamation of reality. I sold the house, the architectural illusion built by the ghost, and moved my daughters to a new city, severing the last physical ties to the past. I returned to my career, rebuilding my own identity based on transparency and strength. Years later, my daughters are grown, successful, and stable. They have adapted to the mystery of their father's absence, though the questions remain a constant, subtle ache. I maintained the security of their inheritance, ensuring their stability was built on my vigilance, not on Ethan's crime. I learned that the deepest betrayal is not simple infidelity. It is the theft of your historical context, forcing you to question whether the person you loved ever existed at all. I survived the identity fraud, the financial disaster, and the psychological terror because my astuto nature demanded the truth, and my bondadoso nature demanded I protect my children. The man I married was a ghost, a legal fiction, but the woman I became, the single, strong mother who rebuilt a life from absolute zero, is devastatingly real. The DNA report proved his lie, but my resilience proved my truth.